I'm Christina Kane, a 38-year-old financial planner living in a city that never quite feels like home. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of my phone's alarm and the buzzing of emails demanding my attention. But my mind is already halfway through the day, calculating numbers, balancing budgets, and most quietly, thinking about the mortgage payment due on my parents' house. It's a payment I've been making for years now, out of a deep sense of duty and love, even though it's never been acknowledged. Years ago, when I first stepped into my role as the family's financial backbone, it felt like a natural extension of who I am. I'm good with money. It's what I do professionally. So when my parents hit a rough patch, it was only logical for me to step in, cover the bills, ensure the lights stayed on, and the roof remained over their heads. It was never about money. It was about keeping my family afloat. But over time, that quiet support became invisible, like a shadow no one notices until it disappears. Family dinners at the Kane house are a complicated dance. On the surface, the table is set meticulously. The food is served with care, and polite conversation flows. But under that polished veneer, there's a tension that clings to the air like smoke. I'm often sitting there, smiling politely, nodding along as my father cracks jokes, my mother glances around the room, and my younger brother Jason occupies the spotlight with his effortless charm. I've learned to keep my head down, to not rock the boat, to pretend the subtle dismissals and passing comments don't sting, because peace, I convinced myself, was more valuable than confrontation. For years, I've been the invisible engine powering this family. I cover the mortgage, pay the utilities, manage medical bills and property taxes. I balance their finances while juggling my own career and personal life, quietly, with no thanks, no recognition. And that's the hardest part, being taken for granted. The sacrifices pile up silently. I've delayed my own dreams, postponed vacations, and set aside my savings, all to make sure they're comfortable. But their gratitude? It's a ghost I've chased for too long. Then, one ordinary afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my Uncle Mark. We're not particularly close, but he occasionally shares family updates or funny clips. This time, though, the message was different. A video clip appeared on my screen, something I never expected to see. Dad, laughing with Mark, calling me their cash cow. The words hit me like a cold wave crashing against a shore I thought was steady. Their cash cow. The phrase echoed in my mind, louder than my own heartbeat. I watched it again and again, the laughter sharp, the tone mocking. It wasn't just a careless joke. It was a brutal truth laid bare. All those years of support, all the money I'd poured into keeping their lives stable, reduced to a punchline between Dad and Uncle. A clip sent by accident, but its impact was deliberate and devastating. I felt exposed, like a secret I'd been hiding was dragged into the light without permission. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the glow from my laptop casting shadows on the walls. The video replayed on my phone, the laughter still ringing in my ears. I pulled up my bank app, scrolling through the list of payments I'd made toward their mortgage, each one a silent promise, a testament to my commitment. And then, I looked at the calendar. The next payment was due in just a few days. A strange unease settled inside me. The clip haunted me, but more than that, it awakened something I'd buried deep down, a quiet anger, a seed of resolve. I marked the date on my calendar, not just as a reminder of the financial responsibility, but as a marker for what was to come, because things couldn't stay the same anymore. The next mortgage payment wasn't just another transaction, it was a turning point, whether I was ready to admit it or not. The roots of our family dysfunction stretch far back, tangled deep in years of unspoken expectations and silent resentments. I was the eldest, the firstborn, the one Daniel and Linda always said should set an example. From the start, that meant I was supposed to be responsible, dependable, and uncomplaining, a role I took seriously, even when it felt like I was carrying the weight of the world. My younger brother Jason, by contrast, was the golden child in their eyes, pampered, protected, and shielded from the burdens I bore without question. It wasn't just the obvious favoritism. It was the way they dismissed my needs and feelings with effortless ease. When I was a teenager, I remember asking Dad if I could join a sports team or take a music class. His answer was always the same. Christina, you have to focus on what matters. Jason's got enough going on. You're the one who needs to hold this family together. I learned early that my dreams were secondary, that my sacrifices were the family's price of admission. Financially, it became a pattern almost as soon as I started earning. When Dad's business hit a bump, or when bills piled up, I was the first call. "Can you cover this for us?" became a refrain as familiar as their voices. I never said no. I wanted to help, because that's what family does, right? But over the years, the help morphed into an expectation, a silent agreement that I would be the safety net while they lived comfortably. Even more painful was the way I was excluded from decisions about money or family plans. Jason might be clueless about finances, but he was the one invited to weekend trips, family vacations, and social events. Meanwhile, I was often left out of the loop, the responsible one expected to stay home and manage the behind-the-scenes chaos. On more than one occasion, I was blamed when things went wrong, like the time Dad's business faltered, and suddenly I was the one who didn't do enough to help. Or when a family trip was planned without consulting me, even though I was the one footing the bills for their home. Linda was another story. Polished and poised, she had a way of controlling conversations and emotions without ever raising her voice. When I voiced concerns or discomfort, she brushed them aside as oversensitivity or ungratefulness. I became the scapegoat for tensions that swirled beneath the surface, absorbing criticism that should have been shared or redirected. Jason, on the other hand, floated through life buoyed by their indulgence. His mistakes were forgiven, his shortcomings overlooked. When he asked for money for his startup, I was the one who lent it without hesitation. It never occurred to me that he might repay me, or that this generosity added another layer to the invisible ledger I kept in my mind, tallying sacrifices no one acknowledged. All these moments, strung together, became my unspoken story. I convinced myself that their behavior was just flawed love, that beneath the neglect and favoritism was a family trying, in their own messy way, to hold together. I told myself that if I just stayed patient, kept giving, kept supporting, maybe one day they'd see me, the real me, and appreciate everything I did. But deep down, the pattern was relentless. I was their financial fallback, their unpaid caregiver, and their emotional punching bag. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. Over the years, it chipped away at my spirit, leaving me tired and questioning whether love was ever meant to feel like this, one-sided and transactional. That's why when the video surfaced, Dad laughing, calling me their cash cow, it wasn't just a careless comment caught on tape. It was the brutal confirmation of all those years of quiet suffering. The truth I'd tried to ignore was staring me in the face, forcing me to reckon with a family dynamic that had shaped my life, but no longer deserved my silence. I've sacrificed vacations, delayed personal savings, and cared for my aging parents without complaint. There's a quiet weight to this kind of giving, a slow, almost invisible erosion of your own dreams and desires. When I look back, it feels like I slowly exchanged pieces of my future for their present stability. Each year, while friends planned getaways or started investing in their own homes, I was writing checks to keep my parents' mortgage current, paying for repairs, and making sure bills never piled up to a crisis point. It was exhausting, yet oddly comforting to feel needed, even if that need was one-sided. I remember the countless times I canceled my own plans. There was a beach trip with Greg, my husband, that I postponed twice because Mom needed help with doctor appointments, or Dad was stressing over some unexpected expense. I told myself it was temporary. That family always comes first. Greg understood, though I could see the strain it put on our marriage. He often tried to encourage me to set boundaries, to ask for help, or even say no, but I never did. Saying no felt like letting them down, like admitting I couldn't carry the weight anymore. When Jason decided to launch his startup, everyone was excited, except me, who quietly became the lender behind the scenes. I didn't hesitate when he said he needed funds, even though it stretched my budget thin. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about keeping the peace, about helping my brother succeed when Dad and Mom wouldn't offer their support. Jason, in his usual way, never brought it up later, never offered to pay back or even acknowledge the loan. It was just assumed I'd keep covering what they all deemed necessary expenses. Linda was a constant presence in this, often delegating financial tasks to me with a casual command that disguised itself as a request. "Christina, can you handle the phone bill and property taxes again? I'm swamped with the garden club fundraiser," she'd say, flashing that practiced smile. I'd nod, hiding the frustration that bubbled beneath. The truth was, I was doing more than my fair share, and yet I was invisible. My efforts were never celebrated or even mentioned. It was just expected, like breathing. Meanwhile, Greg and I talked frequently about the toll this was taking. He worried about my health, about how long I could keep this up before something in me broke. "You're not their ATM," he said gently one night as I sat at the kitchen table, eyes scanning a long list of bills to pay. "You need to protect your future, Christina. They can't keep draining you like this." His words were a balm, but also a challenge I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to believe that my sacrifices meant something, that they were building a bridge to better days. But deep down, even then, I felt the emptiness creeping in. The unspoken rule was clear. My help was a given, my presence taken for granted. And the more I gave, the more I felt invisible, as if my identity was being reduced to a series of payments and favors. Not a daughter, not a sister, just a never-ending resource. And yet, I clung to hope. Hope that my parents would one day recognize what I was doing, not just as financial support, but as an act of love. Hope that Jason would mature and understand the value of what I'd provided. Hope that Linda would see me as more than just a helper. But hope, I was learning, can be a dangerous thing to hold on to when reality keeps pulling you in the opposite direction. Still, every time I handed over another check, made another phone call to arrange payments, or stayed late helping with paperwork, I told myself it was worth it. Family was supposed to be unconditional. You give without expecting anything in return. You keep going because you're the eldest, the responsible one, the backbone. But beneath all those unpaid sacrifices and delayed dreams, a quiet storm was building inside me, a storm that would one day demand to be heard. And that day was coming closer with every missed thank you, every overlooked effort, every whispered joke at my expense that I chose to ignore. Because living like this, giving and giving with no acknowledgement, no respect, wasn't sustainable. It was a slow unraveling, and I was starting to see the frayed edges of the life I'd constructed around their needs, at the cost of my own. The next payment due on their mortgage wasn't just a date on a calendar anymore. It was a reminder of everything I'd given, and everything I was beginning to question. That family gathering was supposed to be like any other, a chance to catch up, share a meal, maybe forget the quiet undercurrents that always seemed to lurk beneath the polished surface of our conversations. But that night, something changed. I still remember the way the living room was lit. Soft, warm light spilling from the chandelier, the faint scent of Mom's pot roast hanging in the air. The table was set with white china and crystal glasses that caught the glow just right. My parents had gone to great lengths to make everything look perfect, as if the careful veneer could mask the tension simmering just below. Dad was in his usual spot at the head of the table, his booming laugh filling the room as he recounted some story from his younger days. Jason was next to him, relaxed and charming as ever, soaking up the attention with that infuriating ease. Mom sat beside Jason, a quiet smile playing on her lips, watching us all with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. And then there was me, forced to sit quietly while the family banter swirled around me like a cold wind I couldn't quite escape. Somewhere between the salad and the main course, Dad's tone shifted. It was subtle at first, a casual jab disguised as a joke, but I felt the sharpness slice through the room like a blade. He looked at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "At least Jason doesn't drain us like Christina." The words hung in the air, heavier than any comment should be at a family dinner. There was a pause, a flicker of surprise from a few relatives, then laughter. Not the warm, inclusive kind, but a cold, awkward chuckle that felt more like a signal. Here's the truth we don't say out loud. Mom glanced at me, her eyes narrowing just a fraction before she dismissed the whole thing with a wave of her hand. "Oh, Christina, you're too sensitive," she said, voice smooth but cutting. "Don't take it personally. Your father was joking." But it wasn't a joke, at least not to me. I sat frozen, the color draining from my face as the sting of his words settled deep in my chest. All those years of sacrifices, the mortgage payments I'd made without a word, the bills I'd covered, the emergencies I'd stepped in for, reduced to being a drain, a burden, their cash cow. I wanted to say something, to defend myself, but the room felt suddenly hostile. My voice caught somewhere between anger and hurt. Instead, I forced a tight smile, swallowed the lump in my throat, and pretended the comment hadn't shattered something inside me. I told myself it was just Dad being thoughtless, that his humor was always a little rough around the edges. But as I looked around the table, I sensed something worse, the acceptance of that cruelty as normal. No one else seemed bothered. They laughed, moved on, and I was left to carry the weight of their indifference alone. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words echoed over and over in my mind. "Drain us like Christina." It was more than just a comment. It was a confession of how they saw me, not as a daughter or a person, but as a never-ending source of money and support. The realization was like cold water poured over my heart, a painful clarity that I'd been invisible in the most fundamental way. I replayed every family gathering, every interaction, every subtle dismissal in a new light. Moments I had brushed off as quirky or unkind suddenly took on a harsher meaning. The way Jason was excused for his lapses, while I was expected to pick up the slack. The way Mom controlled conversations, turning any hint of complaint from me into a sign of weakness. The constant balancing act I performed, keeping the family afloat while my own needs were buried deeper and deeper. That night, I understood that my silence had been a shield, and for years I had worn it like armor against the sharp edges of their neglect. But the armor was cracking. The laughter at the dinner table, the dismissive looks, the absence of gratitude. They weren't just isolated moments. They were the threads of a pattern that had defined my entire relationship with them. Yet, despite the hurt, I didn't lash out. I didn't confront Dad or Mom. I didn't make a scene or demand apologies. I swallowed the pain and told myself to be patient, that this was just one bad night, one careless comment blown out of proportion. But inside, a quiet question took root. How much longer could I keep being the family's cash cow without losing myself completely? That question wouldn't let me rest. It whispered in the dark corners of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. The next mortgage payment was due soon, and while I prepared the funds as always, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting. The family dinner's laughter, the cruel joke at my expense, had broken a barrier. It was no longer just about money or support. It was about respect, or the glaring lack of it. And in that absence of respect, I felt something new stirring, a determination to no longer be invisible, to no longer accept being the punchline of a joke that disguised years of exploitation. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. I could no longer pretend that their words didn't hurt. The silence I'd maintained for so long was beginning to crack, and soon, it would shatter. Then came the video. It was just an ordinary Thursday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from Uncle Mark. We weren't especially close. He usually sent the occasional meme or a quick update, but this time, what popped up on my screen was something I wasn't prepared for. A short video clip, bright and clear, showing Dad and Mark sitting together in Dad's cluttered den. There was laughter in the background, casual and full of ease, but the words that followed slapped me with a cold, gut-wrenching force. Dad, with that familiar smirk and that glint of mischief in his eyes, said in a tone dripping with amusement, "Christina's really our cash cow, isn't she? Keeps the house paid, the bills covered. She's the real provider." Uncle Mark chuckled along, shaking his head as if sharing a private joke. The phrase, "our cash cow," echoed in my mind with brutal clarity, twisting like a knife inside me. I stared at the screen, unable to blink away the sting. This wasn't a careless slip or some throwaway comment. It was a window into what they really thought of me. Here was the man I'd been sacrificing for, mocking my efforts behind my back. The laughter wasn't warm, it was sharp, biting, as if my generosity was a burden he resented but depended on. I felt exposed, as though I'd been standing naked on stage, the spotlight unforgiving. I replayed the clip over and over. Each time the laughter felt louder, the words more deliberate. It unnerved me how casual they were, how comfortably cruel Dad sounded. It wasn't just the phrase, it was the tone, the way he leaned back in his chair, the smug satisfaction in his voice. It was as if my years of covering the mortgage, the bills, the repairs, were a transaction he begrudged but willingly exploited. I couldn't help but think about all those mornings I'd quietly transferred money to their accounts, the late nights recalculating budgets to make sure I could cover their expenses while still keeping my own family afloat. All those sacrifices, turning down vacations, delaying my own dreams, reduced to a punchline shared between two men. And the worst part? The clip was from a recent conversation, not some old joke from the past. They were still thinking this way. Greg was there when I showed him the video. His face shifted from shock to something I recognized, disappointment mixed with fierce protectiveness. "They're taking you for granted," he said quietly. "This isn't just disrespect. It's calculated and it's cruel." I nodded, feeling a cold fire ignite inside me. For years, I'd kept my head down, hoping for appreciation, for recognition. Now, the illusion shattered. The clip also confirmed something else I suspected but hadn't dared confront. They'd been hiding their financial troubles from me. Despite the constant requests for money, the late-night calls when bills piled up, they'd never been fully honest. The playful tone in that video was a mask for something darker: manipulation, a deliberate use of me as their financial lifeline while they mocked the very person who kept them stable. That evening, I sat alone, the apartment quiet except for the soft glow of my phone screen. I scrolled through my bank statements, each transaction a line in a ledger I'd been keeping silently for years. There were payments for the mortgage, utility bills, property taxes, all made without complaint, without acknowledgement. I traced the numbers back months, years even, as the weight of betrayal settled heavily on my chest. The video clip wasn't just a rude joke. It was a blow that forced me to see my family in a new light. I wasn't just the generous daughter or the dependable planner. I was the cash cow, the source of their comfort, the invisible engine they'd been willing to ridicule behind my back. The realization was painful, but it also brought clarity. The next mortgage payment, which was due in just a few days, suddenly took on a new significance. I marked the date on my calendar with a sharp, deliberate pen stroke. It wasn't just a reminder of the financial obligation. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. Something inside me shifted that night, from quiet endurance to simmering resolve. The clip haunted me, but alongside that haunting came a growing unease, a rising determination that I couldn't ignore any longer. I thought about the countless times I'd swallowed hurt and disappointment, about the dinners where I was invisible, the moments I'd been taken for granted. The video was a reckoning. Its accidental arrival felt almost like fate handing me the final piece of the puzzle. It was no longer just about money or family loyalty. It was about respect, honesty, and the limits of giving without receiving. As I closed my phone and looked out at the city lights blinking through my window, I knew things were about to change. The next mortgage payment wasn't just another transfer of funds. It was the moment when my quiet support would face its true test. And deep down, I knew this time, I wouldn't be silent. That night, as the city outside my window hummed softly beneath the glow of streetlights, I sat alone with the video still looping in my mind, a cruel soundtrack to years of silent sacrifice. The laughter of my father, the glib phrase, "their cash cow," reverberated like a bitter echo, no longer just words but a harsh indictment of everything I'd poured myself into. I felt the weight of it settle deep into my chest, a heaviness that wasn't just disappointment or hurt. It was something colder, sharper, like the slow burn of betrayal crystallizing into something undeniable. I pulled my laptop closer, fingers trembling slightly as I opened the files I'd amassed over the years: bank statements, payment confirmations, utility bills, medical receipts. Each document was a testament to my unacknowledged labor, a ledger of devotion disguised as financial responsibility. I scrolled through line after line, tracing the flow of money from my accounts to theirs. Mortgage payments, property taxes, heating bills, repair costs, all meticulously recorded, all generously given without a single word of thanks. But tonight, the numbers took on a new meaning. They were no longer just transactions. They were evidence of a pattern I had refused to acknowledge fully until now. For years, I had been the family's invisible safety net, the one who caught them when they stumbled, who quietly shouldered their burdens while they laughed behind my back. I had convinced myself that love was messy, that family meant making sacrifices without expecting gratitude. But confronted with that video, the cracks in my denial widened until I could no longer pretend. I remembered the countless nights I'd stayed up late, recalculating budgets to cover unexpected expenses, the vacations Greg and I had canceled because my parents' mortgage needed to be paid first, the whispered phone calls from Mom asking for help with bills, the subtle guilt trips disguised as concern. I'd accepted it all with a quiet resignation, believing that this was what being the eldest meant, that my love was measured in dollars and deeds, not in words or respect. But no more. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling as the cold clarity settled over me like a frost. It wasn't just exhaustion. I was grieving the illusion I'd lived under for so long, the illusion that my family loved and respected me as a person, not just a paycheck. The illusion that if I gave enough, if I stayed silent long enough, they would see me truly, appreciate me deeply. The video had torn that illusion to shreds. In that moment, I wasn't just grieving the family I thought I had. I was awakening to the reality of the family I actually had. One where my sacrifices were taken for granted, where my care was exploited, and where respect was a currency I wasn't given the chance to earn. I realized they had no intention of reciprocating or valuing me beyond the money I provided. The phrase, "their cash cow," wasn't a joke or a slip of the tongue. It was a confession, a truth they didn't want me to hear, but one that I could no longer ignore. I reached for my calendar, the one I kept meticulously organized on my phone. My thumb hovered over the date of the next mortgage payment, just days away. I tapped it, creating a note that simply read, "Mark this. Next payment. Important." It wasn't just a reminder. It was a marker, a symbol of a decision beginning to take shape in my mind. This payment, this routine act of financial support that had once felt like a duty and a privilege, was now charged with new significance. It was the threshold between what had been and what was to come. The quiet endurance was ending. The invisible ledger was about to be balanced. As the night deepened, I found myself reflecting on the years of emotional neglect that had accompanied the financial strain. The dismissive comments, the exclusion from family decisions, the way my parents and Jason had glossed over my presence as if I were a ghost in the room. I thought about the aching loneliness of being the dependable one who wasn't depended on emotionally, the daughter who fixed problems but whose own feelings were ignored. There was anger too, a slow, simmering anger that began to replace the grief. Not the explosive kind, but a steady, cold fire that sharpened my focus and steeled my resolve. I understood, with painful clarity, that continuing to give without boundaries only enabled the cycle of exploitation. My silence, my compliance, had been mistaken for weakness, but I was no longer willing to be the family's unacknowledged provider. I closed my laptop and sat back, the city lights flickering against the window like distant beacons. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential conflict and heartbreak. But within me, a new determination was kindling, quiet, resolute, and unyielding. The next mortgage payment was looming, yes, but now it was the date I would no longer let pass in quiet submission. It was the moment when my support would be measured not by blind loyalty, but by respect and fairness. I wasn't just marking a calendar. I was marking the beginning of my own reclaiming. And though the fear of what that would mean for my family stirred in my gut, I knew this was the moment I had been pushed toward for years. The laughter in that video had changed everything. It was time I changed too. That night, as the city's lights blinked softly outside my window, I felt this strange combination of exhaustion and clarity wash over me. The video, Dad's cruel words echoing in my mind, had cracked open something I hadn't dared fully acknowledge before. I wasn't just hurt. I was waking up to a stark reality that demanded action. It wasn't enough anymore to keep giving without boundaries, to hide behind my role as the dependable daughter while the family's exploitation continued unchecked. So, I shifted into strategist mode. This wasn't about anger or confrontation. It was about control, about reclaiming my power in the only way I knew how, through financial precision and careful planning. After all, I was a financial planner by trade. I knew how to map out risks, analyze dependencies, and build defenses. Now I was turning those skills inward, focused on the family web that had quietly relied on me for so long. The first step was mapping out every financial thread that tied me to them: the mortgage payments I'd been covering for years, the utilities that kept the lights on, the property taxes, the repairs, even the social status they maintained by riding on the stability I provided. I wasn't naive. I knew their polished facade depended on my support. Without me, the cracks would show. But the question was, how much longer could I keep being the invisible engine fueling their comfortable lives? Once I laid out the numbers, I started quietly gathering all the evidence I'd stored over the years: bank statements, payment confirmations, utility bills, medical receipts. Each document was like a piece of a puzzle, revealing the full scope of my contributions and their dependence. I organized folders on my laptop labeled Kane Family Expenses, mortgage payments, utilities, repairs, and loans to Jason. Each file was a ledger of sacrifice, proof of how much I had given without ever asking for anything back. Next, I began to look into the legal side of things. I contacted a trusted lawyer, one I'd worked with professionally, and explained my situation without revealing too much. The consultations were discreet, under the guise of routine estate planning, but my mind raced with possibilities: rewriting wills, changing joint account permissions, setting up financial protections for myself and Greg. I needed to shield my own assets from further exploitation and establish clear boundaries that couldn't be easily crossed. I updated passwords on shared accounts, set up alerts on transactions, and even arranged for automatic notifications if any unusual activity occurred. It felt strange to be doing this to my own parents, but after that video, trust was gone. I had to be cautious, methodical, and precise. The old role of the ever-giving daughter was being replaced with something sharper, an advocate for my own dignity and financial security. Throughout it all, I kept up appearances. To the outside world and even to my family, I remained the dependable daughter. I answered calls politely, smiled at dinners, and didn't let on that anything had changed. Underneath that calm surface, though, a silent storm was brewing. I was setting the trap carefully, timing everything so that when the next mortgage payment came due, it would mark a turning point. I felt the weight of this decision pressing down on me. There was fear, yes, fear of family fallout, of broken bonds, of loneliness. But beneath it all, a steely resolve had replaced the old habit of silent endurance. I was no longer willing to let my generosity be a weapon pointed at me, disguised as love. As I closed my laptop that night, the calendar on my phone glowed softly. The date of the next payment stood out in bold, a moment that was quickly approaching. It wasn't just a deadline anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd given, and everything I was about to demand in return. Respect, fairness, and above all, recognition that I was more than just their cash cow. The plan was set in motion, quiet and deliberate. The family's dependence on me was a fragile house of cards, and I was ready to pull the first one out. I knew the hardest part wasn't just making the decision to pull back. It was doing it subtly, invisibly, like a slow drift beneath the surface of their awareness. I started small, almost imperceptibly. The first mortgage payment after I saw that video was coming up, and instead of my usual prompt transfer days before, I delayed it by a few hours. Then a day. I didn't answer the phone right away when Mom called asking if everything was okay with the bills. I let the message go to voicemail, my heart pounding in that brief silence. When I finally called back, my voice was calm, even casual, but inside I was bracing for impact. They noticed, of course. Dad's tone over the phone was sharper, a little edge creeping into his usual charm. "Christina, what's going on? Is everything all right?" he asked, though it was more accusation than concern. Mom's emails became more frequent, each one laced with that familiar guilt, subtle reminders about payment deadlines, hints about financial strain, and the unspoken but clear expectation that I would come through as always. But this time, I held back. I didn't rush to reassure them or promise immediate help. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watched how it unsettled them without a word. At family dinners, I started withdrawing in small ways too. When Linda asked me to call the utility company or handle some unexpected expense, I hesitated. My usual quick, "Sure, I'll take care of it," was replaced with, "I'll see what I can do," a phrase weighed down with uncertainty. I stopped volunteering for extra financial chores, no longer the eager problem solver. The subtle shift was like a crack in their carefully maintained system, but nobody said anything outright. Instead, there was a strange tension, like a room where everyone knows the silence is heavy, but no one wants to break it. Dad and Mom tried to explain it away. "You must be stressed with work," Dad said one evening, his smile tighter than usual. "Maybe you just need a break." Mom nodded along, offering that polished sympathy she always wore when things got uncomfortable. But I knew better. They were scared, or maybe just uncomfortable with the fact that the dependable flow of money and care was no longer constant. Their world, so used to my support, was beginning to wobble. I caught myself watching their reactions, noting the subtle signs, the quick glances, the way Dad's jaw tightened when I declined to cover a new expense, or how Mom's eyes flickered with something almost like worry when I didn't respond immediately to a text about a bill. The control I'd unknowingly maintained over their finances was slipping, and with it, the unspoken power I'd held. It was strange to feel that power shift after so many years of carrying their burdens willingly. Meanwhile, I took quiet steps behind the scenes, formalizing my boundaries with legal documentation, updating account permissions, and changing passwords. These moves were invisible to most, but they tightened the safety net around me and Greg, our assets shielded from further overreach. I wanted to be ready for whatever fallout might come, knowing that financial independence was my strongest defense. The family's reliance on me was so ingrained that their blindness to what was happening was almost palpable. I sensed their denial in the way they dismissed my pulling back as temporary fatigue or stress. But beneath their surface calm, tension grew, like a pressure cooker slowly heating. The unsaid hung in the room, thick and electric, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but unsure when it would fall. I didn't make announcements or accusations. I kept my face calm, my tone measured. To the outside world, I was still the dependable daughter, the one who always made sure the bills were paid, the paperwork done, the house kept afloat. But inside, I was calculating every move, watching how far I could push before the carefully balanced family dynamic would crack. The stakes were high, and so was the risk of losing everything I'd worked so hard to protect. Yet, even as the tension simmered quietly, I held on to a fragile hope that this subtle withdrawal of support would force a reckoning, that the family might finally see me not as an endless resource, but as a person with limits. I wasn't sure if they would rise to the challenge or crumble under it, but one thing was clear. The old way of silent sacrifice was over. The next mortgage payment, the next call, the next family gathering, each would test the fragile balance I'd disturbed. As days turned into weeks, I felt the weight of this quiet rebellion settle over me, a mix of liberation and dread. I was no longer just the family's financial backbone. I was becoming the architect of change, even if no one else saw it yet. The slow pullback was more than a tactic. It was a declaration that my support came with conditions, and that those conditions were about to be tested in ways none of us could ignore. The day the next mortgage payment was due arrived with an unsettling calm. I woke early, the usual routine humming in my veins, checking the calendar, reviewing account balances, preparing to transfer the funds that would keep my parents' home afloat for yet another month. But this time, something in me shifted. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard as the painful echo of that video clip pulsed in my mind. Dad's laugh, the phrase "their cash cow," the casual cruelty, These weren't just words anymore. They were a message, a boundary crossed that demanded a response. Instead of initiating the payment as I always had, I paused. The clock ticked forward, emails came and went, and the transfer remained undone. I wasn't ignoring responsibility. I was reclaiming control. I drafted a message, clear, calm, and professional, informing my parents that from this point forward, they would be responsible for their own mortgage payments. I included details about the due date, the bank account information, and resources they might need to set up the payment themselves. No anger, no blame, just facts. I hit send and leaned back, the weight of that single action pressing down on me. Later that day, I received a flurry of responses. Dad's first call was sharp but controlled. "Christina, what's going on? Why haven't you made the payment? We've always counted on you." His voice carried a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled frustration. I kept my tone even, explaining that I'd done the math, reviewed the situation, and decided it was time to draw a line. "I'm happy to help in emergencies," I said, "but ongoing support has to change. It's not sustainable for me anymore." Mom's email arrived shortly after, polite, but with a thinly veiled guilt. She reminded me of the bills piling up, the repairs they were facing, and how much they'd depended on me over the years. But I didn't engage with the guilt or the pressure. I simply reiterated that they were responsible now, that I trusted they'd manage it as they had before my involvement. The tone was firm, but fair. I was setting boundaries, not burning bridges. As the days passed, I shared the video clip with Greg, who had stood by me through all the pain and planning. Watching Dad's laughter, hearing the dismissive words, Greg's jaw tightened, and his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "They've been hiding this cruelty behind closed doors for years," he said quietly. "It's not just about money, it's about respect, something they never gave you." His support was the anchor I needed as the storm began to build. Quietly, I reached out to a few trusted family friends, people who knew the dynamics and had witnessed my struggles. I shared parts of the video with them, not to humiliate my parents, but to expose the pattern of neglect and manipulation. Their reactions were telling: shock, sympathy, and a newfound understanding of why I'd remained silent for so long. This wasn't just family drama. It was a deep betrayal that had been hidden behind polite smiles and holiday cards. Meanwhile, I took swift legal steps. I met again with my lawyer to finalize the changes to joint accounts that would protect my assets and sever automatic control my parents had over certain finances. I drafted formal notices removing Dad and Mom's access to accounts I managed. I secured my own savings and investments, ensuring that my financial independence was airtight. The irony of having to legally shield myself from my own family was not lost on me, but it was necessary. The absence of that payment hit the family fast. Bills went unpaid, notices appeared, and the comfortable lifestyle Dad and Mom had taken for granted began to show cracks. I monitored the situation from a careful distance, resisting the urge to intervene or explain beyond what was necessary. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer the invisible engine keeping the machine running. At family gatherings, the change was palpable. The usual light-hearted facade faltered under the weight of unspoken tension. I noticed Dad's forced smiles, Mom's distracted glances, and Jason's growing discomfort as the financial safety net they'd always relied on disappeared. The silence around money grew heavy, an elephant in the room that no one dared to name. Yet, through it all, I maintained my composure. I was no longer the eager caretaker, but the woman demanding respect and fairness. My boundaries were firm, my resolve unwavering. The video had been the spark, but the real fire was my determination to rewrite the rules of our relationship. This moment was not just about withholding money, it was about reclaiming my dignity, demanding accountability, and ending years of silent exploitation. The family's sudden panic and scramble to adjust revealed just how much they had depended on me, and how unprepared they were to face the consequences of my absence. I watched the unfolding drama with a bittersweet mix of sadness and empowerment. Sadness for the family I'd loved and supported, but empowerment in knowing I was no longer invisible or expendable. The next mortgage payment had been more than a date on a calendar. It was the first step in a journey toward respect and self-worth, the first move in a carefully crafted strategy to change everything. And as the days stretched on, I knew the hardest trials were still ahead. But for the first time in years, I faced them not as the family's cash cow, but as a woman standing firmly in her own power. The moment I informed them that I wouldn't be covering the mortgage payment anymore, the calm I had maintained shattered almost immediately. It was as if I'd pulled the rug out from under years of unspoken assumptions and unchallenged dependence. The panic set in quickly, and it swirled through every interaction that followed like a rising tide I couldn't stop. Dad's phone call came first. His voice was sharp, tight, a careful mix of disbelief and desperation. "Christina, what the hell is going on? We've always counted on you." I could hear the edge of frustration beneath his words, the thinly veiled accusation that I was abandoning them when they needed me most. But I held firm, my tone steady. "Dad, I've thought this through. I'm not abandoning you. I'm setting boundaries. I can't keep doing this alone." His silence on the other end was heavy, filled with unsaid things, before he finally spoke again. "You're making a mistake. This isn't fair." Mom's responses were different, but no less intense. She flooded my inbox with emails, each one dripping with guilt and subtle reminders of how much they'd depended on me. One email read, "Christina, we're barely managing. The bills are piling up, and the house needs repairs. We never asked for this to be your burden. Can't you find it in your heart to help just a little longer?" Each message felt like a carefully aimed arrow, wrapped in concern but aimed straight at my conscience. I refused to engage with the guilt trips. I replied with measured professionalism, reminding her that we had always communicated about finances openly, and that this was a necessary step for me to protect my own family. Meanwhile, Jason emerged into the picture like a reluctant mediator, an awkward, uneasy presence trying to smooth things over, but clearly out of his depth. His calls were tentative, filled with half-hearted apologies on behalf of the parents and clumsy attempts to downplay the situation. "Hey, Chris, maybe we can all sit down and talk this out. It's been tough on everyone." But the truth was, Jason had never faced real consequences before. He was the golden child who'd never been asked to take responsibility. Now, without my financial cushion, the cracks in his entitlement began to show. His voice, usually so confident, wavered under the weight of the reality he'd ignored for so long. The love bombing started next. Texts from both Mom and Dad, sweet, desperate, and insistent. "We love you so much. We never wanted to hurt you," Mom wrote once, followed by a message from Dad. "You're our daughter, our family. Let's not let money come between us." But beneath the words, I recognized the same old pattern, emotional manipulation wrapped in the guise of affection. It was a last-ditch effort to reel me back in without confronting the real issues. I wasn't falling for it. There were also veiled apologies, but they all felt hollow, rehearsed. "Maybe I was wrong to say those things," Dad said in a voicemail. "I was just stressed." But stress didn't excuse years of exploitation or that cruel video. I didn't respond to the apologies. I let them hang in the air, knowing that words without change were just noise. The family's strategy shifted quickly as their panic deepened. I noticed the subtle attempts to guilt-trip me in person. Mom's tight-lipped smiles at dinners, Dad's sharper-than-usual barbs disguised as jokes, Jason's awkward questions about when I'd come around. The tension was palpable, an electric charge in the room that neither they nor I wanted to acknowledge openly. Yet the walls felt like they were closing in. Some relatives who'd always been on the sidelines began to distance themselves as well. They seemed uncomfortable with the upheaval, wary of taking sides or stepping into a family conflict that was now spilling into public view. Invitations to family events dwindled, calls went unanswered, and the polite facade of Kane family unity cracked further. It was as if the truth I'd exposed was too raw for some to face. Greg stood by me throughout this storm, his support unwavering. When Dad's call ended in frustration, Greg would just hold my hand and remind me, "You did the right thing." But even he could see how exhausting it was, how much this battle was draining me emotionally and physically. I was no longer just fighting for financial fairness. I was fighting for my dignity, my self-respect, and the hope of healthier boundaries. As the days wore on, I watched the family's anger and denial simmer beneath forced smiles and restrained conversations. Their manipulations, the guilt, the love bombing, the veiled apologies, began to lose their power. My silence was no longer compliance. It was a statement. I wasn't the family's cash cow anymore, and they couldn't pretend otherwise. The fallout was painful and immediate, but it was the only way forward. The family's scramble to adjust revealed the depth of their reliance on me, and the cost of their years of taking me for granted. The balance of power had shifted, and with it, the old dynamics were unraveling. I felt the sting of loss, for what the family had been and what it had become, but beneath it all lay a quiet, fierce hope that change was possible. And even as the storm raged around us, I held on to that hope, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long journey toward respect, fairness, and, most importantly, reclaiming my own life. The foreclosure threats started arriving quietly at first. Letters slipped under the door. Urgent emails flagged in bold and relentless calls from the mortgage company. I watched the notices stack up on their kitchen counter when I visited, the paper crinkling under my fingertips like an unwelcome reminder of what my silence had enabled. It was a jarring sight. The home I had poured so much into, both emotionally and financially, suddenly teetering on the brink of loss. The reality was brutal. My decision to pull back was rippling out faster and wider than I'd anticipated. Social whispers began swirling almost immediately. I heard snatches of hushed conversations at grocery stores, murmurs from neighbors who once admired the Kane family's stability. "Did you hear about the Kanes? Foreclosure notices and all that drama." The polished veneer my parents had worked so hard to maintain was cracking, and the community was quick to notice. It was as if the family's private chaos was now public fodder, a cautionary tale about what happens when the facade of wealth is just that, a fragile mask. What stung the most was the impact on the family's business ventures, many of which were tied to the finances I'd long supported or managed behind the scenes. Projects ground to a halt as funds dried up, contracts were delayed, and partners grew wary. I'd always known those ventures were more than just investments. They were pillars of my parents' identity, their hopes for legacy. Seeing them crumble, powerless to intervene, was a bitter pill. But I reminded myself, this was the cost of years of neglect and exploitation masked as familial love. Alongside the financial unraveling came the toll on health, both mine and theirs. The stress carved deep lines on my face, and I felt the weight dragging me down nightly like a physical ache that sleep couldn't heal. But I wasn't the only one. Dad's blood pressure soared, his charm replaced by irritability and exhaustion. Mom's polished composure cracked, replaced with tense silences and moments of brittle tears. Jason, who had always been shielded, suddenly looked smaller, overwhelmed by the consequences he'd never had to face before. Their attempts at victimhood were relentless. Calls from extended relatives arrived, bearing false sympathy and veiled threats, trying to pressure me into resuming support. "Family is family," one aunt said, voice thick with assumed righteousness. "You can't just walk away when times are tough." Emails flooded in, some disguised as concern, others blunt demands, but I documented every message, every interaction, not just for my peace of mind, but as a shield against manipulation and blame. Some family members, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, began to show signs of genuine remorse, their apologies hesitant but heartfelt. They reached out, cautiously testing boundaries, perhaps realizing for the first time the depth of their hurt and my exhaustion. But most doubled down, deflecting blame and painting me as the villain in their story. Their denial was a wall I could no longer scale, and I stopped trying. My role was no longer to fix what they refused to see. Friends and neighbors, once distant observers, started questioning the Kane family narrative. Invitations became scarce, casual greetings faded into silence, and social circles closed doors once open. The isolation was painful, but also clarifying. It was a shedding of old ties weighted by pretense and entitlement. I mourned the loss of the family image, but embraced the truth beneath the rubble. Through it all, I stood firm, drawing on the strength that had been built quietly over years of silent endurance. I wasn't immune to the pain, but I was resolute. This was the messy, difficult aftermath of setting boundaries, a reckoning long overdue. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, the lesson was unmistakable. Respect and fairness aren't optional in family, and love can't be the excuse for exploitation. Now, the stakes had been raised beyond what I ever imagined would come from a simple family dynamic. After all these years of silent support, the balance had tipped irreversibly. The Kane family was at a crossroads. They could either accept the consequences of their actions and begin to rebuild relationships on an honest, respectful foundation, or they could lose me, permanently. And deep inside, I knew I wasn't willing to be the safety net anymore if it meant sacrificing my dignity. I established clear, non-negotiable terms for any future contact with them. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, equality, and financial independence. I told them, in calm and measured words, that any further interaction would require acknowledgement of my boundaries and a genuine effort to treat me as an equal, not as an endless resource. I wasn't just setting limits on financial support, but on emotional labor as well. No more dismissive comments, no more belittling jokes, no more being the invisible backbone of a family that refused to see me. This new chapter brought a strange sense of relief, even as it carried a weight of uncertainty. Part of me mourned the family I once hoped for, the one where love and sacrifice were met with gratitude, where my presence was cherished rather than taken for granted. But that hope had given way to something sturdier, the understanding that respect must be earned and boundaries must be fiercely protected. I shifted my focus inward toward the people who truly valued me. My husband Greg, our children, and close friends who had stood by me through thick and thin. With Greg's steady support, I began reclaiming parts of my life that I'd set aside for so long. We planned trips without checking in on my parents' needs first. I invested in my own retirement accounts and created savings earmarked solely for my family's future. These weren't just financial moves. They were symbols of self-care and empowerment. I was no longer invisible or expendable. I was prioritizing my own well-being without guilt. The Kane family, meanwhile, faced the reality of the void I left behind. The comfortable lifestyle they'd enjoyed, propped up by my contributions, faltered. They had to confront the tangible consequences: unpaid bills, mounting stress, and fractured relationships. Some family members started to grasp the gravity of their actions, tentatively reaching out with signs of remorse and the beginnings of self-reflection, but others remained entrenched in denial, preferring to cast blame rather than accept responsibility. The walls they'd built around dysfunction and entitlement started to crack. I noticed the subtle shifts in family gatherings. The tension replaced some of the old ease, but also created space for new conversations to possibly take root. I wasn't sure if healing was on the horizon, but the false peace born of exploitation was over. I learned that love, while powerful, is not a free pass for abuse or neglect. Setting boundaries wasn't a betrayal of family. It was a necessary act of self-preservation and respect. I was redefining what it meant to be a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a woman in control of her own life. The lessons I carried forward were profound. Respect must be mutual, and dignity cannot be bartered away for silence or financial support. Looking back, I realized that the journey I embarked on that day, when I marked the date of that mortgage payment differently, was not just about money. It was about reclaiming my voice, my worth, and my future. The Kane family was forced to face the consequences of years of taking me for granted, but I was finally free to live on my own terms. The road ahead remains uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I feel the strength to walk it with my head held high.